Lately, I watched the Metatron's assessment of the analysis of ancient warfare tactics in movies by Roel Konijnendijk. During his assessment, the Roman Testudo came up. Konijnendijk described the Testudo as a cumbersome and impractical battlefield tactic, but Metatron did not agree with him. He said that it was easy and used frequently by the Romans. I want to make my own analysis to support Konijnendijk's claim. The reason is that the testudo has been blown out of proportion. It seems that no movie about Roman soldiers can be made without the appearance of a testudo. It's time to put testudo in its proper context. First of all, what is a testudo? Testudo is the formation in which the Romans form an all-round shield defense with connecting or even overleaving shields. It does not only protect the soldiers from the front and the sides, but also from projectiles from above, with shields which act like a tiled roof. In other words, it offers defense against the enemy from all sides. As the shields have to connect, it's a very tight formation, which does not only require a lot of discipline, but also stamina to keep your shield in the correct position. You can't relax or move to flex your muscles. The soldiers who hold their shields up must be strong enough to keep their shield up for a significant amount of time. This formation makes the Roman unit practically impenetrable for blows and missiles, but at the same time it also makes it very slow to move in order to maintain the formation. This is attested in the word testudo, which means tortoise. The practicality of the testudo becomes evident from its description. The formation requires strong men who have been thoroughly trained in performing this formation. You can do it with dozens of men, but it's not practical with hundreds of men. The larger the testudo, the longer it takes to get into formation and the easier it is to fall apart, especially if it has to move. This uncovers an often overlooked fact, the weakness of the testudo when forming. The Roman unit is at its most vulnerable when the men have to break up their existing formation and get into testudo formation. It requires the officers and men to concentrate on moving themselves and their equipment, especially their shields, instead of focusing on the enemy. In other words, the enemy can't be in close proximity when forming the testudo. The testudo formation must be finished before being in direct contact with the enemy. This brings us to our next point. Why would you deploy as a testudo on a battlefield? What would be the compelling reason to get in such a formation? One could argue that it protects the men against arrows and stones. Again, we have to have a look at the practical conditions. The effective pelting distance is less than 50 meters or 30 yards, so you have to have your testudo formed and ready within 10 seconds in order to avoid the enemy crashing into your formation when it's still forming. You need to have really steady and well-trained men to do this, because they are being pelted and at worst the enemy would be storming at them to exploit the time your men are breaking up their current formation and forming up the testudo. The question is whether the risk is worth the benefit, and this brings us to our next point. The next problem is that if you are on an open battlefield and you are in testudo formation, you instantly nullify two important assets: striking power and speed. Once in testudo formation, you can no longer use your javelins or lance. It also makes you practically immobile. The Romans did not call this formation testudo, which means tortoise, for nothing. Moving in testudo formation is slow because you need to keep in formation, which is challenging if you're on the move. This brings us to another overlooked aspect of the testudo: command. It's almost impossible to receive commands if the Testudo is part of a larger army, because you can hardly see or hear signals within the Testudo, because being encapsulated by shields not only blocks projectiles but also sound. Within the Testudo itself, it's hard for the officer to get an idea about what is going on due to the limited vision and to deliver commands regarding its direction. And this brings us to our next point. The Testudo not only limits mobility going forward or backward, but it's almost impossible to make a Testudo turn left or right without losing its formation. It would require a very thorough drill to make a turn in the first place. The order to turn should be heard instantly by everybody in the formation, and it should be clear to every soldier how fast he has to move in the desired direction. Again, this presupposes that the enemy is not near to disrupt the move or exploit any gaps which might appear. In practice, a testudo can only go forward or backward unless there is peak unit cohesion of thoroughly trained men. In practice, the testudo can only be performed with relatively small units of several dozen men, if you wish to move around with them. Which brings us to the next problem on the battlefield. Why would you break up your army in penny packets? The testudo nullifies the use of javelins and spears and breaks up your army from a cohesive linear force into smaller and slower formations. Your enemy, on the other hand, will enjoy the advantage of movement without being pelted. The enemy will swarm around your relative immobile testudos and attack you from all sides. This brings us to our last but not least point. How can you come out of testudo formation? Even if we regard the testudo as impregnable, you can't stay in this formation forever due to physical strain. The testudo has to break up at some point, which makes it vulnerable. The breaking up is even more perilous than the formation because you need to spread out to allow the disentanglement of men, weapons and shields from a tightly packed formation. Again, it's unwise to do this in the proximity of the enemy, as this will open a window of opportunity for the enemy to attack. The testudo is, in other words, not a practical formation in open battle. It divides up your army in penny packets, limits the use of javelins and spears, limits the speed of your units, and makes it almost impossible to command them, let alone move them in a particular direction, other than forward or backwards. It doesn't mean that it never happened on the battlefield, but it was certainly not some kind of battle winning tactic. If employed on the battlefield, it would most likely be to retreat in good order when the large army was broken up and the enemy was in pursuit. At that moment, the enemy would be spread out and also lose formation, and under these circumstances, an all-round defensive shield wall would give a small group of soldiers in retreat the best chance of retreating in good order and prevent them from being overrun by cavalry. The most common deployment of the testudo would probably be when the Romans would storm a walled fortification or an enemy in a fixed position like an earthen rampart or a hilltop. This would allow the Romans to form up a testudo from a safe distance and nullify the enemy's advantage of pelting heavy objects from an elevated position. The interlocking shields would absorb the weight of heavy stones and diminish the effect of hot liquid being poured down. Under these conditions, the testudo only had to go forward or backward, so it offered maximum protection while demanding minimal risk effort in terms of maneuver and exposure to enemy direct contact. It could even act as a rampart over which soldiers could reach a low wall or rampart. Let me know in the comment section what you think of my analysis. Was the testudo a typical Roman battlefield tactic, or is it an overblown Hollywood phenomenon? Either way, let me know what you think. If you like my content, don't forget to subscribe and like and leave your comments.